So welcome back to the walled garden. Here we are in mid-September. The weather's starting to change. We're starting to see some transition to fall in the garden. We're just coming off a very warm and hot and dry summer, so things are looking a little tattered here and there, but I'd like to take a moment and walk through the borders and look at some of the things that really exemplify the garden for the beginning of fall. So the first plant, and one that I think is really fun, is Cornus alternifolia. And this one is Argentea. I think Argentea is sort of Latin for silver. And the variegated foliage on this plant gives it sort of a silver tone once you step back and look at things. This is what some people call a nativar. So the species is native, but this is a cultivar of the plant. I'm not sure I love the word nativar, so it's a native cultivar. That's easy enough to say, isn't it? What's really interesting about this and where it gets its common name of the pagoda tree is that as opposed to most of the dogwoods you think about, the native dogwood or the Cusa dogwood, is that it has this very tiered appearance to it, and so the branches come out. I think of it as sort of a wedding cake. Again, the common name is pagoda tree, but this particular cultivar will only get to about 15 feet, so you can think of it as a big shrub or a small tree, but this layered habit gives it a really interesting contrast to the shrubby stuff that we planted around it. So just down the border a little bit, I'm standing in front of this Abelia. It's Abelia grandiflora Rose Creek. I think its common name is Abelia or glossy Abelia. It's a really great plant. These glossy small leaves emerge sort of reddish pink in the spring, followed by these flowers that last from spring all the way into fall. And sometimes it can be a deciduous evergreen, but it does get a purpley cast to the foliage that usually persists all winter long. For contrast, we planted it next to this Fothergilla, and it's a cultivar of Fothergilla called Blue Mist. I think you can see that for its blue-green leaves. I think this one actually is Blue Shadow. There's a handful of the blue cultivars of Fothergilla. Even the straight species is great. You get really interesting spring flower, and it's always followed by really great fall color in yellows and oranges and reds throughout. Interestingly, behind me here, staying in the blue vein, is this Eucalyptus that we planted as an annual filler last year in the border just to fill up a spot. It came through the winter, and so we've never been able to overwinter or even tried to overwinter a eucalyptus, but here it is turning into a small tree. And just behind the Abelia is another plant that we planted as an annual filler that came back, would be hardy in the south, in the tropical south, but managed to come through the winter here too. It's a Leycesteria, which we love to use as a container plant, but here it is in the border. And speaking of container plants that we use as filler, we've been growing this year for the first time this Gomphocarpus. It's a African milkweed, and it's commonly called hairy balls or family jewels milkweed. It's also called swan plant, which I think my mother would be more accepting of the name. And it's called a swan plant for these flowers with the white recurved petals and the purple interior petals that resembles a swan. So a really fun plant that I was excited to plant when we first got started here at Untermyer is this Albizia julibrissin. This is a cultivar called Summer Chocolate for this dark foliage. The problem is it turned into a big tree very fast, and so we were tempted to just remove it from the garden, but I thought that would be a shame, so we cut back the trunk to just 18 inches, 24 inches this spring, and this is the resultant shrub that's come out of its place. So we'll probably just keep it cut back every year and look for rejuvenative growth that gives us this sort of presentation. And it's really fun that it's working with this hydrangea. This is a hydrangea called Snowflake. Sometimes I'm not really keen on the heavily doubled hydrangeas that get very weepy, but as the petals are starting to go tawny, it looks really interesting, especially next to our mimosa. And here in front we have a yellow Deutzia, which adds another little color contrast to that as well. So still here in the east border, and I'm standing next to our stoa, which we talked about, this wisteria earlier in the year, but I just couldn't walk by this Brugmansia. It's a cultivar called Charles Grimaldi. Again, the cultivars are almost irrelevant. Pick a color that you like. This particular one is supposed to be especially fragrant, and it certainly is. It's also known as Angel's Trumpet for obvious reasons. Maybe that makes up for the hairy balls earlier on. And underneath that, we have a plant that I've loved to grow since I started gardening, is a Cuphea. This is an ignea cultivar. There are a handful of different sizes and different leaf textures for this orange Cuphea. I also know it as cigar plant or cigar flower, and it just makes a great underplanting with this Brugmansia. And then I just happen to be standing by some really cool plants. This is a pair of aloe, just aloe vera, and intermixed with an agave. I think an Agave americana variegata. There's several different variegated species or cultivars. Choose the one that is most interesting to you. We grew these all from houseplants that were donated by Jessica Norman, and now they've turned into staples of our container display. So thanks for walking around on this early fall preview. We'll keep an eye on the garden and keep you abreast of what's happening all through the fall.